All right. Okay. Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. As always, I'm delighted to have John here presenting on self-improvement. So with that, I'm just going to hand it over to John. John, take it away.
Thank you. So welcome everybody. I'm deeply appreciative for everybody spending their evening with me. I see a couple new names in here. Welcome. We discuss every single week. I usually try to attribute either traits or concepts to works of fiction, and we discuss them. For everybody that's returning, welcome back. This week we are talking about Daniel Keyes' novel Flowers for Algernon and the importance of comprehensive development. Now, reading is not mandatory. I always summarize the necessary and relevant points. So we're going to go through that. I'm going to briefly summarize the I guess, context material. Then we're going to look into the concept of comprehensive development in itself. And then finally, thirdly, we're going to look at how we can apply these concepts that we learned today. What can we learn from the individual in this story? And what we really take home from this. So the investigation into the text, the dominant narrative, the underlying theme of this story is these researchers and psychologists and scientists undergo this experiment, and what they're trying to do is significantly increase the order of magnitude of somebody's intellectual capacity. So they do it successfully on a mouse, hence the picture here, and Algernon is actually the name of the mouse, hence the title. So they do it successfully on a mouse. It solves mazes really quick. I don't really know how else you can cognitively test a mouse. So it solved mazes really fast and improves performance and everything. So they decide to extrapolate. Let's say, okay, let's run a human trial. Let's see if this surgery can be translated over into the human realm. So they find a subject, in this case, the main character, Charlie. He is significantly cognitively impaired. I believe the number was thrown around. I think he had like an IQ of 70 or 80 or something very low like that. So they're like, okay, this is an ideal candidate, right? And the book is written from his diary entries, essentially, his first person. And the experiment is successful. So we see his, arguments getting a little bit more cohesive, his thoughts getting a little bit more complex, his spelling increases. I think it's really interesting how the author kind of entails down to that very small detail. So the trial is successful, but the main character very soon realizes that intellect is not everything. Okay, you cannot solve everything by superimposing your logic onto every problem that you have in your life. So he goes through a series of trials and tribulations and realizations and observations throughout his journey. And then I'm going to briefly describe 9 of them. So the first one that he realizes, the first major, I guess, observation or awareness or principle that he learns is the phenomenon of psychological projection. So the main character works at a bakery doing very menial and trivial tasks, such as, loading up the oven with muffins and things like this, and carrying out orders, like very trivial, low level things. And how he realized psychological projection, he starts to realize that the coworkers, which he once deemed his friends, were actually kind of bullying him. They're making him embarrass himself in front of other people. They were always laughing at him and never with him. When his IQ was 80, he didn't realize any better. They were picking fun at him. They would bully him. They would have him embarrass himself in front of people in public. They would laugh. He would laugh along. He's like, oh yeah, we're all friends. We're all having a good time here. He didn't know any better, which is tragic. So that's the first thing that he realizes. He's like, okay, people are not always out for my own good. The second realization is, I would say, suspicion and anger at the world, partly stemmed because of this realization of psychological projection. So it's partly manifest from him realizing all the times in his life, and he keeps having flashbacks from childhood, even not just in the bakery, of every time he was bullied, every time he was exploited, picked on, etc. And he starts getting angry and suspicious even at the psychologists and the researchers. And one manifestation of this is when he's doing ink blot tests. So they want to do like cognitive baseline tests to measure his capacity. So they have him do a test right at the beginning of the story, and he doesn't see anything. He thinks the doctor is playing a trick on him. The doctor is trying to say, hey, there's images in these ink blots. And Charlie's like, no, it's just ink. Like, it's spilled ink. Like, you spilled it this way, you spilled it that way. He's just not getting it. And he remembers this. He has a flashback as he's a little bit more cognitively able. He tries to go back in for the ink blot test, and then he gets suspicious that the psychologist is actually playing a trick on him, trying to embarrass him again. So that's another realization he has. The third realization is the, I guess, reality of human nature. So the professors and the psychologists and the leading scientists of his experiment, he would idolize them. He would put them on a pedestal. He believed they were the most like they were the biggest geniuses he's ever met in his life. So he would put them on a pedestal. He would say, oh, I hope to be as smart as them one day, etc. And then as he starts to grow his intellectual abilities, he realizes that they didn't pick him to help him be smart. Okay, they have their own careers. They have their own reputation on the line. They have their own aims and intentions with the study itself. So they want to be, they want to take credit essentially for this breakthrough surgery or breakthrough method. And it's like they didn't do it to help him personally. They didn't know him. They were really indifferent. It could have been interchangeable with any other test subject. And that's what he starts to realize. So that was the third realization. Another realization is, I would say, the phenomenon of like romantically repressed desires and thoughts. And this manifests when he begins to feel attraction toward his he once had a teacher named Alice. And he starts to feel attraction for her in his adult life. And he's trying to conceptualize this in a logical way. He's trying to explain it. And he runs into a lot of trouble with these feelings of repressed guilt, of him not being worthy of affection. And this largely stems from his next realization, which is his complexes that he had received from his mother. Now, his mother was a deadbeat mother in his childhood. She instilled in him several detrimental beliefs. Few things she did. One was saying she would never accept his cognitive impairment. She always would attribute it to a matter of lack of effort. She would say, you're stupid because you're not trying hard enough. Try harder. Try harder, try harder. I'm not accepting that you are cognitively impaired and you're going to underperform the other students. So little trivial things she would do. Let's say he was a very young kid. He's playing with a toy. She would rip the toy out of his hand and say, no, go study your alphabet. Go study your numbers. Go study your times tables. You have to learn. And this would lead him to be upset and crying. There was one time where he had a newborn sister and she left the room. He picked up the sister to cradle her. And she says, no, you're not able to do that. Don't ever touch your sister again. I'll put you in a cage. You don't deserve that. And then when he was a little bit older, the sister would have friends over and she would say, don't look at the sister's friends like that. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking dirty thoughts. You don't deserve those thoughts, etc. So she was a terrible person. And this led him to have many complexes, but he wasn't aware of them well into his intellectual advancement. So he had those particular complexes. The sixth realization, we're going to get through these very briefly. The sixth realization is a moral dilemma when he's still working at the bakery, but he's cognitively improved at this point. And he realizes one of his coworkers is actually stealing from the organization. So he's undercharging customers and pocketing the difference. So let's say somebody comes in to buy a cake. It's $5. He charges the customer $3, pockets the $2, continues on his day. He realizes this, and then he's in a dilemma. He says, what do I do? Like intellectually, logically, sure, it's wrong. But I don't want this guy to lose his job because he has a family to feed, he has kids to feed, etc. He can't go anywhere else for a job because he was a criminal or whatever the particular reason was. So he has a moral dilemma here because he's experiencing this dichotomy between, I guess, the head and the heart, if you would say. The next realization and observation he comes across is the phenomenon of him being dehumanized and objectified. And this happens there's a psychological conference in Chicago where his researchers that are appointing this whole phenomenon going on, this whole study, they're presenting their whole case, and he feels like a test subject and not like a person. He doesn't feel heard. He notes several times in the story, they're talking in the room about him as if he's not there. And at this point, his IQ is like 150 or something wild like this. So he's much smarter than all of the researchers around him. So he just feels really guilty. He feels really alienated from this entire situation. And this arises a lot of emotional discomfort in him. The eighth and almost final realization he has is that of the dichotomy between, I would say, the head and the heart. So he starts to realize that not every instance in his life, not every problem, not every scenario can be solved with logic alone. And he greatly realizes this after he believes he falls in love with Alice, and he's trying to articulate these like conditionings. He's trying to articulate why he feels the way he feels about her and not about another girl that he went out on a date with. So he believes he's in love, but he says not like all the answers aren't in books. In other words, that's a quote from the book. So he's having a dilemma there. The ninth and final realization I think is important here is his attitude in a given set of circumstances. So the tragic twist of the entire story is later, I would say probably 75% of the way through, he learns that the mouse actually hits a zenith in cognitive capacity and then plummets back to baseline. So that's tragic, right? And then he does all these studies, he does all these extrapolations, he's up to date in the newest psychology and all these research, because again, his IQ is like 170 or 160 or something. So he conceptualizes his impending doom. He realizes it, he proves it, he writes a psychological paper, he shows it to the colleagues in the study. He's like, okay, I'm headed back for where I was, IQ an 80. And it's tragic. It's of course tragic because he knows it's coming, but he doesn't have a positive attitude toward this fate. He gets really resentful. He gets really bitter. He gets angry at the world. He starts pushing people the way that he cares about. He pushes Alice away. And he just has a really bad attitude. And Alice actually points this out. She says, okay, when you were less cognitively impaired, at least you were positive. At least you were optimistic. And now you're just an arrogant, narcissistic know-it-all, and you're really selfish and impersonal to everybody. So that is pretty much the 9 realizations of the principles that I have extracted from the story in sequential manner. And now I want to go into the implications of this story, and that is namely comprehensive development. So to elucidate these points, I'm going to read 2 quotes from the story itself, and we're going to dive into the implications there. So this is later in his journey. This is right before he starts pushing everybody out of his life. This is at his cognitive peak. So he comes to these very wise conclusions. He says, intelligence and education that hasn't been tempered by human affection isn't worth a damn. So like cold impersonal logic without human emotion is worthless. And you can look at this and instantiate it in several ways. Let's look at this from an evolutionary perspective. I would look at that as the equivalent of objective information and advice versus having that same advice, those same principles, those same precepts, those same methods imbued into a narrative format with archetypes and stories involved. So you can see this in modern society as well. If I were to take any movie and deconstruct it and just say the principle out of it, it wouldn't have much merit. It wouldn't have much value because it's not emotionalized. So this, from an evolutionary perspective, we have a oral tradition that helps us retain in memory the principles of a story much longer if it's in a narrative form. So that's why we have like these old Greek myths, these fables, all of these oral traditions before we had invented writing and capturing things in history. We were able to remember very, very complex stories such as the Iliad or the Odyssey just from intellectual memory, because they have these archetypes in them, because they are imbued and tempered by emotion. They're tempered by human affection instead of just cold, hard logic. So in other words, let's look at something like the hero's journey. If I were to say, okay, you should get outside of your comfort zone and overcome your obstacles, and then return to the city or return to baseline as a better person, right? That's basically the hero's journey, just in a very logical sense, right? It's not saying, okay, leave the walled city. Again, that's symbolism. That's a metaphor. Okay, slay the dragon. That's another metaphor. Extract the gold. Another metaphor. Return to your city and inspire the youth. Another metaphor. Because all of this is imbued with emotion, and it's the perfect coalescing. It's the perfect mixing between both hemispheres of the brain, so we fully remember that information, and it's a lot more potent than just logical information. So that's what I think the main character meant by that. The second implication I want to dive into here is another quote, directly follows after it, where he says, intelligence is one of the greatest human gifts, but all too often, a search for knowledge drives out the search for love. Intelligence without the ability to give and receive affection leads to mental and moral breakdown, to neurosis, and possibly even psychosis. So he has this conclusion as just intelligence for its own sake leading to a breakdown, because in fact, it was his means to an end. And he was viewing it as an end in itself. So if you look back shortly in the introduction of the story, one of the complexes that he's developed from his mother is to equate intelligence with worth. So she constantly hammered in his subconscious mind, you are going to be smart one day, just like the other kids. And he didn't feel like he was worthy of love and affection and admiration unless he was intelligent. So that's one of the most tragic things in the story, because that's why he's so excited to undergo this surgery in the beginning, because he says he's excited to have intelligence, not for the intelligence sake, but so that he can, quote, I'm excited to be smart so I can make friends and not be lonely. Like, what a rude awakening he had in store for him. So that he wanted to be smart so he could address the means of having a community, of feeling affection, of feeling loved, and he forgot that. He jettisoned it because it was uncomfortable, because it was bringing up a lot of psychological, deep-rooted turmoil that he had from his childhood, and he didn't want to address. It was accompanied by a lot of fear. So whatever reason, he negated all that. He ignored it and just focused on intelligence because it was comfortable, because it was easy. And that's why it led to this conclusion. It leads to, as he says, mental and moral breakdown. That's a very strong conclusion. So the third thing I want to read from the story is, again, right after this. It's another interesting observation. He says, the mind absorbed in and involved in itself as a self-centered end to the exclusion of human relationships can only lead to violence and pain. When I was retarded, I had lots of friends. Now I have no one. Oh, I know lots of people, lots and lots of people, but I don't have any real friends. Not like I used to have in the library. Not a friend in the world who means anything to me. No one I mean anything to. So he has this kind of victim mentality, of this self-defeatist mentality, as if he didn't really, as if he wasn't the author of these circumstances for himself. And this is especially expressed at the, I guess, climax of the whole story, which is the most, I would say, depressing part, is Alice, who's the woman he falls in love with, and she's reciprocating his emotions. They really like each other. At the end of the story, she's aware of this cognitive decline because he tells her, and she's like, that's tragic, but let's capitalize on the time we do have together. You're at, several orders of magnitude higher in the IQ score right now. So we still have another few weeks, few months before we're at least even maybe a little bit less. And then we can like part ways when we feel it's the need to. And he's like, okay, he's a little bit reluctant. And then as time goes by, he notices his cognitive, his consciousness slipping, and he's forgetting little trivial details. He's repeating himself. He's forgetting tasks. He forgets how to speak 5 languages. And he, instead of like addressing this and having a love of fate, amor fati, which, quick side note, Nietzsche actually says, my formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, which means love of fate. Not only to bear what is necessary, but to love it. So that's a very different attitude than what Charlie had. So he was bitter, he was resentful, and he prematurely kicked Alice out of his life, while they still had plenty of time to enjoy their lives together, enjoy the rest of the time they did have. So he kicks her out. He says, you know what? This is time. You need to leave. Because, again, he was resentful. He was psychologically projecting. He was taking his anger out on her. He says, get out of my life. I can't deal with this. So he kicks her out. She comes back knocking at his door. The psychologist knocks at his door. He ignores everybody until he's back at 80 IQ. It is tragic. So those are the implications of the story, the importance of cognitive development, or comprehensive development, rather. And finally, I now want to look at what we can apply from this, what we can learn from Charlie, what we can learn from what not to do in this situation. So the first thing I would say is engage in as many experiments as possible. Ralph Waldo Emerson says, all life is an experiment. The more you make, the better. And I think we do this for many reasons. I mean, one, the most pertinent one, is to realize our blind spots. It's easy to overestimate our competence. It's easy to be the proverbial big fish in a small pond and never grow, never challenge ourselves, never get outside of our intellectual comfort zone, or even physical comfort zone for that matter, and grow. So we're not going to realize blind spots if we only stay in one particular realm. So that's what Charlie was trying to do. He was only trying to advance his intellect, advance his cognitive capacity, because that's certain, because that's easy, because it's predictable. It doesn't really have that much discomfort as emotions do, right? The emotional realm, love, affection, being vulnerable with a partner, that's much more, I would say, frightening to the average person. So the second application we can have is to quantify our lives in a humble manner. So once we find these blind spots from experiences, we should have a methodology of organizing our life or reflecting on our life and saying, okay, why, like, if I was uncomfortable in this situation, what can I learn from it? Or if I failed, what is the seed of equivalent benefit or advantage I can extract from this temporary defeat? Okay, you have to have a very healthy and constructive attitude towards vulnerability, towards temporary defeat, towards failure, towards being embarrassed, towards being exposed, etc. So there's a lot of contingencies involved in that, I understand, but we should humbly, I guess, metricize our own lives and have feedback internally with ourselves. Another point is to never never justify mediocrity or complacency. So it's very easy for us to, again, stay stuck in these ruts and psychologically justify things by saying, let's say, I'll use an example of, I don't know, fitness, okay? If I say, okay, you should be in this certain shape by, I don't know, summer, or you should be in the best shape of your life, et cetera, and you intellectually understand. And instead of somebody saying, okay, you're objectively right, I would have all these emotional benefits, I would have physical benefits from getting in shape and getting my health together. And then here's where the excuses come in. And I would look at it as this defending complacency, as saying, not everybody can get in the best shape of their life. Oh, there's some people with genetic conditions. There's some people who don't have the time. You don't understand how much time I spend on my kids or my work or this, that. And it's like, I mean, yes, I might give them the benefit of the doubt, but I would say 1% of the actual cases. In other words, a lot of people make excuses to psychologically justify complacency out of fear of escaping their comfort zone. So never do that. That is extremely detrimental. And so be cognizant of what you were defending, really. When somebody says you should do this, or something that's appealing to you intellectually, but it's out of your comfort zone, it makes you afraid or it makes you uncertain, you should, instead of justifying and attacking and getting defensive on that, question that uncertainty in yourself, question that feeling of unease, of discomfort, and address it and realize, what are the action steps I can take here? So I would look at fear and discomfort as indicators, actually. If you're not feeling fear or discomfort or uncertainty, or I guess being overwhelmed in some sense, you're too complacent in your life. If you're not uncomfortable, often you are very complacent. You're too complacent in your life. You're not going to really achieve any beneficial results that are worthwhile. And oftentimes, I mean, you can substantiate this with looking at people's surveys of people at the end of their life. Most people regret more what they don't do than what they do. Okay, so that's a very important thing to keep in mind. You don't want to live with constant regret. Discipline is an easier pain to pay than regret. And the final point that I have is kind of tailored off that, looking at fear as indicator. And this is actually from a poetry book, interestingly enough. And I thought this passage was particularly eloquent and well, very well said. So I think it's relevant to share here. And it says, perhaps all the dragons in our lives are just princesses who are only waiting to see us act just once with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love. So going back to the example with like mythology and Joseph Campbell and Hero's Journey, all the dragons in our lives, okay, of course that's symbolic, to represent obstacles, to represent anything that's uncertain, anything that's threatening, anything that's outside of your comfort zone. So in the face of those, perhaps those things are only waiting to see us act only once with beauty and courage. And we know that it's the first step is obviously always the hardest, but again, momentum will always perpetuate and really further the evolution and development from there. So that is the summarization of what I got from Flowers for Algernon. That is what we can learn for the importance of comprehensive development. Two more quotes that I want to share that I was thinking about as I was putting this presentation together. One is from Aristotle, where he says, education of the mind without education of the heart is no education at all. The second is from Erich Fromm. He wrote the book, The Art of Loving. And he says, people tend to develop their potential insofar as they cultivate reason and love. So again, there's a dichotomy here of comprehensive development of the head and the heart. If you want to see these principles in action, I would actually recommend reading this book if you have the opportunity to. But with that said, thank you everybody for attending. I will now pass it to Shrikant to moderate questions.
Excellent. So now we come to the next stage where you get to ask questions. After the questions, we're going to do breakout rooms for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to come back. When we go to breakout rooms, John is going to specify the questions. And then after the breakout rooms, we're going to come back in about 30 minutes to share our takeaways. All right. And after the takeaways, you're welcome to go back to the breakout rooms. Okay. So that's the plan. Now for questions, to ask questions, you can either type the question, type exclamation mark in the chat, or raise your hand in Zoom. So first question is from Joe. Joe, go ahead.
Hi, John. Thank you again for presenting this evening. It was awesome as always. Do you find the stories more about misaligned priorities that, sometimes people look at it as when they pursue money, right? And just as he's pursuing intelligence, as if this is what meaning is, and ultimately it's love. So that it's really just an idea that of fulfilling and what is meaningful. Yes, ultimately it's this thing that he could have had at any IQ. And, and there's a certain thing with, the idea of money. Yes, you'll pursue it, but it's not fulfilling in and of itself, just as intelligence isn't pursuing. So that once you achieve it, then you realize if you have no one to share it with, then it's meaningless. So that's the absence of love. So it's do you find that this is really a story of misaligned priorities?
That's actually a very profound insight. I didn't think of that before, but it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. I think there would be somewhat of a barrier in his so obviously he had a lot of deep psychological complexes that were very toxic, namely like equating intelligence to worth. So I don't think like without the cognitive capacity to cultivate your shadow, to look into your psychological turmoil, I don't know that he would have even had the potentiality to address that seed, right? I mean, at least when he was intelligent, he could put it together intellectually. He's having these flashbacks. He's like saying, oh, wait, they really didn't care about me. Oh, wait, these people weren't laughing with me. They're laughing at me. Oh, I can actually put all this together. Now, is he going to address that? That's an entirely different subject, right? Because you're exactly right. He never wanted intelligence. He only wanted, you can look at it in the most basic sense. He only wanted love from his mother. That was it. He wanted acceptance from his mother, which he never got throughout his life. I actually left this detail out, but they actually abandoned him when he was, I don't remember how old, probably teenager, young adult or something like this. They abandoned him. And he was just too oblivious to know what was going on. Like his whole family abandoned him. So it's a very tragic story, but you're absolutely right. He only wanted love. And intelligence was supposed to be the methodology, at least in his belief. And it's not like you automatically get smart and you're automatically a celebrity and a virtuous person and everybody loves you. Absolutely not. You have to do all these other things, which is something that he learned. But I only looked at it from this perspective because it wasn't haphazard that he got very intelligent. He would deliberately go to libraries and study and do all these things, discuss with college students when he was like on his ascent. He would discuss with college professors. He would look at all these researchers and consume books for hours and hours and hours on end a day. So that was very deliberate on his end, because I think he was still working with that subconscious belief or hope that it would somehow pass a certain IQ marker, like immediately equate to love. And that was his mistake. And I think tragically, he never really addressed it. You know what I mean? He had that little brief window of like Alice and like that little encounter. But like I said, tragically, I think that's why this book pertains so hard in my memory, because it's so tragic. Like he never really experienced and found what he was looking for.
Thanks, Sean. Next up is Jonathan. Jonathan, go ahead.
Thanks. That was a great talk again, John. So thank you. I'm thinking about I really like this idea of this dichotomy between cultivating the mind and cultivating the heart. And that quote that you gave by Aristotle, that's great too. So I'm thinking about the relationship between them, and have you given any thought to how Charlie could have cultivated more of his heart? Because I'm thinking like, okay, there's that intellectual component that you sometimes need to untangle things. Like you look back at a memory and you connect it to other memories, and then you go, okay, what I wanted was love from my mum. And there's this intellectual process that you have to use to get there. And then you've got to put it into practice. So then you've got to address that heart aspect. So I remember that scene where he had this issue being with Alice alone. This was his teacher from when he was in the state school. And then he tried to force himself to be with her. He tried to push through it by turning off the light. I don't know if you remember that scene. And so I can't think of what, like in your mind, can you think of anything else he could have done to cultivate his heart in a better way, as opposed to just the intellect?
Yeah, so any development, any advancement, any growth in any category comes from vulnerability and being uncomfortable. So you look at that in what's an emotional manifestation of being uncomfortable, being vulnerable, I would say to openly accept. I think the main one was openly accept his fate at the end with Alice and not like projecting on her and blaming her and like condemning her and not pushing people away, because he did this multiple times. I didn't watch the movie, I only read the book, so I don't know if there's any like other like frivolous details that might be left out, but I would say just being vulnerable and being open to like the confusion. He wasn't open to the confusion because he was trying to articulate how he felt, especially early on in the story when he started to feel this weird affinity for Alice. He didn't understand what it was, because you can't intellectually like verbalize exactly what love is. And he was trying to do that. So he's like, okay, maybe if I learn more, I can actually define this, or I can know exactly what to do. And then he comes to the realization, no, these books don't tell you these things, along with the moral dilemma thing. These books don't tell you these things. You have to trust your own heart. You have to trust what you believe to be true. And I mean, this is going back to last week with conscience. You have to trust your own internal vocalizing mechanism that it's going to lead you in the right direction. He never trusted himself. He never trusted his own urges. He was repressive of them. He was repressive of this, particularly this like sexual guilt associated from the complex that his mother gave him, that manifested itself through his relationship with Alice. He felt like he wasn't worthy. Hence there's the scene with a young Charlie, if that's what you're talking about. But I would say be vulnerable. I would say be open. And trusting his own intuition and not pushing people away when he was uncomfortable, because he wanted to be alone so he could try to figure it out intellectually. But that was a mask to try to not feel what he was feeling.
So my takeaway is, I think the main thing for me in what you said is, it's like the book and the character serves as a reminder for no matter how smart you get or how much you cultivate your intellect, there may always come that time where someone is giving you love or something similar, and you can either accept it or turn away from it. And just no matter how smart you are, it's easy to still turn it away from fear.
Exactly.
So yeah, thank you.
Next one is A. A, go ahead. A, you need to unmute yourself. Okay, let me read out the question. The question is, how to trust your internal compass when you don't trust yourself?
I don't know what I would define as the distinction between yourself versus your internal compass, but I would say to test it in contrast with the external results it manifests in the world. So in short, trial and error, okay? Like actualize that voice, embody that voice from an intellectual idea into tangible realm of results, and see if it's worthwhile. See if it has a net positive gain on everybody that it affects. If so, absolutely, it's beneficial. It's constructively, it's objectively constructive. Absolutely trust it. I don't know if you were here last week. I was talking about Socrates. He actually deemed all of his wisdom to the fact that he never betrayed this voice of conscience or intuition. He always, 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 without fail, listened to this voice and what it demanded him to do. He was like, okay, whatever this is, it's from an ethereal source. It clearly knows more than I do. And you can look at whatever interpretation you wish out of this. If this is like your channeling with infinite intelligence, if this is your subconscious mind, if this is your super ego, if this is the amalgamation of all the subconscious experiences you accumulated until that point, whatever you define it as, I would look at that as wiser than your conscious mind, and I would listen to it. So I would just say trial and error in short.
Okay, A, you have unmuted yourself. Would you like to do a follow-up or any further questions?
Yeah, I guess that was a good answer. Very philosophical. When I'm posing that question, I'm thinking about my subconscious mind and how my conscious mind might be in conflict with like what subconsciously it is what I want and what I need. And maybe I've had some things happen this year. You know, this whole year has been rough for everyone, I'm sure. But I've had some things happen where I've kind of fallen from grace in myself. Like I feel like I betrayed myself at my core, and it's had a lot of negative consequences on my own belief in my abilities and belief that I can achieve certain things. I felt like I've suffered a great loss, like I can give you a synopsis. Like I lost my job recently during COVID. I was laid off, and
may I suggest one thing? How about talking about this in the breakout rooms? Because we record this. I don't want to have personal stories, kind of deep personal
oh, I
stories
see.
here.
Okay.
Okay,
Right.
so I would
Yeah.
encourage you to talk about it in the breakout rooms. Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
You're welcome.
Next question is from Jory. Jory, you had a comment about Alzheimer's. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Okay, so I was thinking of Alzheimer's disease. I saw the film. I didn't read the book, but I saw it in preparation for this. And my family has Alzheimer's disease. It's quite probable that I will have it if I live long enough. And when you have it, you can see that you are losing your mental capacity. And you know it doesn't improve, and at this point doesn't look like there's going to be any way to medically improve it in the near future. So but people have different reactions to this knowledge, including my you can be angry and bitter and suspicious, and you can be just kind of happy and often confused and friendly and reliant on strangers and very happy to be so. And if we had a choice, I'd rather be happy, but I don't know if it's a conscious thing. In fact, I rather suspect that it's deeper in the personality type than I can just say, I'm going to have a good attitude now, because who's going to suffer but me if I don't? I wish I could, but
Thank you,
so I'm kind of responding to John's assessment of points in the novel about the development. You may not necessarily have the option to steer your development the way you would be happier.
Thank you, Jory. John, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, a few things. First of all, I was actually reading a few books on neuroscience. Alzheimer's symptoms actually cultivate and are perpetuated in physical changes of the brain that manifest as early as people's 20s. And these are example of lack of physical exercise, smoking, excessive drinking, poor diet, etc. So long story short, we should eat well, we should exercise, we should have diets high in omega-3, 6, and 9s. MCTs, medium chain triglycerides, coconut oil, etc. With all that health stuff out of the way. I think that's a good observation. I mean, I would look at that as maybe that's something, I don't remember her name, A was addressing, that there's this bifurcation, there's this split of like this conscious mind that's like holding up an identity or something like that. And then the subconscious is maybe the true character that is coming through without that conscious barrier, that is, maybe that conscious barrier is upholding an identity, or it's contriving expectations that or it's fabricating something that that it wants other people to perceive them a certain way. So once maybe that's attributed to the intellect, maybe that's the job of the conscious mind. Once that's gone, maybe the actual authentic character comes through. And then maybe that's like the manifestation of temperament, like angry and bitter or happy. So, yeah.
Okay. Next up is Sanjay. Sanjay, go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to look at the story from a different perspective. I mean, I agree with the notion that Charlie was looking for love primarily from his mother, but also from everyone. But I believe that all good stories have multiple layers of meaning. So here's another interpretation that I wanted to throw out and get input on. So to me, the story is also about difficulties that Charlie saw that came not mainly from himself, but from the inability of the world to grow with him. Basically, he grew in abilities and in intellectual and other abilities. However, the world did not, and none of the characters around him gained intelligence or understanding or empathy. And this disparity between them, I think, led to all of the problems that Charlie experienced. So in this way, the ending, we can see the ending as really a restoration of the world order that Charlie had originally. And in a way, we might even be tempted to say that Charlie regressed his mind back to his earlier self because that was a safer and more ordered view of the world where he didn't have these problems. So, what's your interpretation on this?
I mean, that would be contingent upon a complete jettison of responsibility for circumstances on Charlie's behalf. So that's saying he would, that's the like quintessence of I would say a victim mentality in that case, because Charlie wouldn't go out of his way and say, okay, I want people that are empathetic. I want people that are compassionate, etc. He can go out and find those people. But he was attracting people that were able to trigger his emotional development. Okay. So that those, in short, those people are exactly who he should be around, who are mistrustful, who are deceitful, who are arrogant, who only care about their own cause in a psychologist relationship, who don't know how to completely be there for him, like his lovers. But these triggering aspects are exactly what he needed to advance emotionally, and he failed all of those. Okay, so he only grew intellectually, and he failed all of the emotional tests in his life. So that, I mean, the story is tragic, but I do see merit.
My point was not that he.
From what I was understanding, it's like you're describing the disparity of him being so far and being this developed person in the world being underdeveloped, right?
Well, not underdeveloped, that the world didn't move forward with him. Basically, he moved forward and the world remained where it was. And the world really failed to see anything new in him. They continued to see him in his former self. And so the world was the one that was failing him. I
mean, I would change that, and I would say you find in the world what is within your subconscious mind. You find your beliefs extrapolated into reality through your perspective and your attitude. So I wouldn't say the world is ever static. I would say the world is continually and perpetually dynamic depending on your attitude toward it. You're going to find what you look for, in other words. So he was looking for those things. That's only what he's found.
Okay. Next one is Cheryl. Cheryl, go ahead.
Hi. I was just wondering if the moral of the story is really just that ignorance is bliss, because he became so delusioned with everything he was discovering about reality when he quote unquote became intelligent, that he just saw that it wasn't because he didn't really change except that he became more aware. So I'm just kind of wondering if awareness of circumstance is not more cause for concern than just your own ignorance.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting take. I mean, as Sanjay was just saying, like, I mean, what makes novels great is their ambiguity, right? They're not unequivocally one thing, right? There's a myriad of interpretations that can be superimposed on it. But I will save the answer for a presentation back here in 3 weeks. We're actually talking about, I found an episode of Black Mirror that actually encapsulates this idea of, is ignorance bliss? I would say no, not at all. It's very dangerous. But I'm gonna suspend my question and my answer until that. We're gonna thoroughly discuss all the implications surrounding ignorance is bliss, and I believe it's 3 weeks time. So, but thank you.
All right, John, I think it's time to go to the breakout rooms so we can discuss this in great amount of detail. Do you want to pose the questions? You have them handy?
Yeah, so for anyone new, we go into breakout groups, I don't know, average 6-7 people, depending on the total number of people here. And we pretty much facilitate discussion around these 3 following questions. They don't have to be particularly in order, but I just found 3 questions that I think are thought-provoking. 1, if you feel comfortable sharing, what is your most and least developed trait? Okay. So in Charlie, obviously, most was intelligence, least was maybe emotional capacity or something like that. So what is yours? What are some pros and cons of the 2 methods of either 1, doubling down on your strengths, or 2, balancing out your weaknesses? So there's 2 approaches to growth in life. Do you want to be like a jack of all trades, or you do want to be like the embodiment of one thing? Okay. What are the pros and cons of each approach? And finally, what do you believe from my summary, or if you read the book yourself, what do you believe is the #1 trait that Charlie needed in his life that would make him more fulfilled, more happy, more successful, more loving, etc.? So yeah, those are 3 questions. What are your most and least developed trait? Number 2, what are the pros and cons of doubling down or balancing out your weaknesses? And thirdly, what do you believe that Charlie needed in his life? So we are going to, I think, Shrikant is going to automatically situate us into these rooms. Is that correct?
Yes. So just a couple of things. These questions can also be found on the meetup page if you want. And I encourage you to lead the discussion based on these 3 questions. Please, follow the 3 rules that we have. Number 1, keep on topic. Number 2, be brief so that everybody gets a chance to talk. And number 3, be courteous. Feel free to disagree with anybody on anything, but please be courteous. So I'm starting the breakout rooms now, and we'll automatically be back here to share our takeaways in exactly 30 minutes. Talk for maybe about 2 to 3 minutes about what you're taking away from this meetup and the breakout rooms. So we're going to start with, it's going to be, and if you don't want to share your takeaways, you can just type skip in the chat and I'll skip you. So it's going to be, let's see here. It's going to be Mark. Would you like to go next? So Mark, and Christopher is next. Mark, go ahead.
Oh, this Mark? Okay, all right, thanks.
Yes.
I'm going to keep it brief because I see there's a lot of people on. So, yeah, I found the questions very interesting. Yeah, the story of Algernon is obviously very tragic. I think my major takeaway from this was, we discussed in our group, was just the fact that if he'd had more time, if he hasn't been starting to revert, it would all be very different, because then he would have the time to learn through life experience the things that he had obviously missed out on as a child. So that's the real tragedy. It's not like he needs any trait. He doesn't need to be more intelligent. He doesn't need to be more empathic. He just needs time to develop as a human being. For that, well, I say he basically had a bad, or he lacked a childhood that everybody else got.
Okay. Next one up is Mai, followed by Christopher and Becky. Mai, go ahead.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. So I'd say tying question 1 and 2 together, in line with Marty Seligman's work in positive psychology, I'd say, in general, for most, it would probably make more sense to double down on your strengths. However, if there is 1 or more weak, lesser developed traits, rather, that are, let's say, 2 or 3 standard deviations with respect to the other ones that you've cultivated, then it would probably be best worth your effort to put a lot of work on weakness until you reach a point where it would make sense to switch back onto doubling in strength.
Thanks, Michael. Next up is Christopher, followed by Becky, followed by Paul S. Christopher, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm going to skip it this time.
All right, Becky.
What my takeaway was, or is that if there is a weakness that is crippling and on the extreme, it is worth investing into bringing that closer to the average. But when you look at yourself in terms of like character traits, there's value to working on your weaknesses. But when you're not isolated and you're looking at a team environment, then you can really work off of the weaknesses, the strengths of others to complement your own weaknesses. So there, it would be beneficial to double down on your strengths.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Becky. Next up is Paul, followed by Wayne, followed by Michael. Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, we were just going down a path that was good in the end of our little group that I'll just mention, which is trying to start debating with one another. If he was going to take the approach of using his strength to address his weaknesses, how could he have done that? So how could he have applied his intelligence to help himself, which relates to methods of therapy and things like use your strength to address the weaknesses. We were just starting to discuss that. So I think it's an interesting angle. That's all I'll say.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Next one up is Wayne, followed by Michael and Joe. Wayne, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess so. I was in the same group that Paul was in, and I guess I was skeptical about using intelligence itself to effect some type of long-term fulfillment. I haven't seen any studies that correlate, what is tracked in IQ to fulfillment in life. I think that what he went through was a loss of something, and it didn't seem like he was just able to deal with that loss. And that's an emotional skill. So that's an EQ skill, not an IQ skill. So yeah, I don't think it has to do with strengths or weaknesses. I think in this case, he just didn't have something. So maybe that was a case where he needed to bolster a weakness, in my opinion.
Thank you, Wayne. Next up is Michael, Joe, and Jonathan. Michael, go ahead.
One thing that stuck out to me was it was related to question number 3 about what did he need. And I think this one thing that he needed was somebody to relate to, somebody in the same wheelhouse mentally. And that just kind of pointed out how important it is to actively seek out people that are more along your frequency rather than staying with the people that you're familiar with but are not pushing you forward.
Thank you. Next up is Joe, Jonathan, and Deborah with H at the end.
There's a lot of taking away from this. Is one of them is that our greatest strengths can be our greatest weaknesses. So the idea that this idea of IQ was improving, well, then that turned into a weakness because he lost faith in people at that same time. So that this, there's this interesting relationship that exists sometimes that, with what we deem to be a strength and value may not actually reflect what's actually meaningful. And I think that that's the most important part that I'll take away from this, is that what is meaningful in life. And that's the important part of this story, because it's not about intelligence, just as it is not about material things. It's about others. And the real tragedy is that he lost faith in others while he gained this intelligence. And that was a shame. So I'll just take that dichotomy away.
Thank you. Next up is Jonathan, Deborah, followed by Bob. Jonathan, go ahead.
Thank you. So just a more general takeaway is that there's so many connections to be made in this text, and lots of principles that came up that I didn't recognize, I didn't see while I was reading them. So the connections like to Tolstoy's example of a doctor who can't empathize and understand the value of another person and sees everything as like the weighing of probabilities, and then Aristotle in educating the heart and the mind, and Emerson on I forgot the word, the compensation, which is John discussed that a bit in the room we had, and yeah, all the connections to be made that are things that they're just common to our experience as humans, and then the value of really reading through a text and having that be a memorable experience you can come back to for those principles in a more concrete form. I think so. My takeaway is to do more of this, basically.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Next one up is Deborah, followed by Bob, followed by Anon.
Okay. I didn't really think that the third question was necessarily a fair one. I didn't really know how to answer that. I felt like he had this whole new world thrust upon him. Basically, everything changed out, like everything just out from under his feet. Like, and I felt like we're looking at this from our perspectives, where it's very different. We've had time to sort of like cultivate relationships with people and responses that are more typical, and we've had years to do this. And I think people touched on this before, that this happened very quickly, but also everything changed and then everything regressed. And I think to expect that he would have time to like stop and smell the roses, or to even be able to be kind of contemplative, is asking way too much. Like, it was just all this stuff was happening to me, he was reacting, and it was overwhelming. And I feel like, yeah, I don't even know if everything's thrust upon you how you would act differently.
Thank you. Next one up is Bob, followed by Anon, followed by Sarah. Bob, go ahead.
From the first moment, he had to be mindful and aware of what he had and for how long. That's what he needed. From the very first second that he acquired super intelligence, he had to know, how long do I have this, and what can I do with it? Like, what are my options? What choices can I make to improve my life from here on out? Like, that should have been the first thought in his mind. Like, oh, can I be even smarter? Or what can I achieve? But I feel that the character got distracted in several detours in his life, and the clock just ran out behind him, below him. I mean, and by the time he notices what was going on and tried to do something about it, it was too late. Simply, the clock ran out on the guy. Like, that's what I feel that happened to the character, and that was a tragedy.
Thank you. Thank you. Next one up is Anon, followed by Cheryl, followed by A.
Well, I regret that I missed the majority of the story sharing, but I've been able to grok enough from what people have shared to say that this is a very personal story for me, because I had a high level of intelligence, much higher than what I have now, prior to a traumatic brain injury. And during that period of time of almost 30 years of, I'd say 25 years of existence in adulthood, I had a very high level of meaning, very privileged to be able to experience fulfillment and meaning and purpose. So when I hear the comment about, the trade-offs, at this point in my life, I actually would gladly trade off meaning and purpose in life, which I've had, for greater intelligence to experience things that I feel are very sadly out of my reach, and that I really wish I would have done when I had the certain capacities that I had before. Instruments and language skills, foreign language skills, and just a number of different things. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very touching. Next up is Cheryl, followed by A, followed by Deborah with an A. Cheryl, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just, I think the theme for me was whether or not self-awareness is necessarily better, and how our strengths and weaknesses are subject to external measures, and our response to those external measures being whether or not we rebel against criticism or are motivated by positive reinforcement of our strengths. And I think you need to play on your strengths to develop your weaknesses. So that was just my takeaway.
Thank you. Next up is A, followed by Deborah. A, go ahead. Okay, next up is Deborah.
Hello there. Yeah, I have 3 things. So quickly, number 2, we had talked in our group about when you develop your strengths, it could lead to a satisfying career. So if you find out what you're good at and you really develop that, then it can lead to a satisfying life. And then number 2, we were equating at one point getting all of this intelligence rather quickly for Charlie was in a way like a lottery winner getting too much money very suddenly. And so if you put the analogy together, if you get something that valuable that quickly, you don't necessarily know how to handle it in one fell swoop, and it can lead to a lot of complications, as it did in the story. And then last of all, I have my undergrad in psychology, and one of the things that really stuck with me in my studies was the external locus of control versus the internal locus of control. And that is a theory that came about back in 1954, which is 4 years before the story was written. And I wonder if that played into this theme, where you feel like the control of your life is outside of you, as Charlie did when he got this surgery and he was able to gain all this intelligence, that it wasn't within him to acquire the intelligence or to construct it, but it was outside of him, versus an internal locus of control where you feel like you are in charge of your life. You are in charge of becoming the person you want to be, and your emotional IQ and your acquisition of knowledge. So those are my 3 points.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're
Next up,
welcome.
next up is Mike, followed by Nari. Mike, go ahead. Okay. It's Nari. Go ahead, Mike.
Can you hear me?
Yes, barely, Mike. Mike, your audio is always really bad, but so you need to speak into the mic. Go ahead.
All right, let's try this. I view this as
Mike. Let's do one thing. You please type up your takeaways. I'll read it out for people. Thank you. Next up is Nari.
Okay, so I wanted to kind of build off of Mark and Deborah with an H's, and actually the person who just spoke recently as well, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, about how unfair it was for Charlie to be kind of thrust into the situation. People, I think because he was age-wise an adult, people assumed that he was emotionally and mentally an adult and able to deal with these difficult kind of situations and emotions, and he really never had the experience or practice in doing it, and nobody provided any guidance, or they expected him to be able to figure out these complications on his own as well. So of course he didn't deal with them well, and I think that was an inevitable end to it, unfortunately.
Thank you, Nari. John, what I would like to do next is I would like to talk about the approach that we learned. I always like to bring in the syntopical angle whenever possible. And when we studied Principles by Ray Dalio, he had amazing things to say about weakness, and which I think are very easy. I think it'll be very useful to kind of recount that. So let me go ahead and put forth his views, and you can add to it. So Ray Dalio, it's very interesting because Ray Dalio says, look, everybody has weaknesses. Everybody has strengths, everybody has weaknesses. So the question is, what do you do about them? Most people, there are 4 things you can do about the weaknesses and strengths, weaknesses in particular. So number 1, you can ignore them. You can evade them. And which is what most people do. They refuse to actually, kind of accept, to kind of come to terms with their weaknesses. So first, you can evade them, which is completely self-defeating strategy. Now, once you accept your weakness, the question is, what kind of strategies do you have? First one is that you can work with people. We are social beings. We cooperate with people. You can work with people who are strong at things that you are weak at. Because as a team, you can do very well doing that. So that's first strategy. Second strategy is you can learn a little bit. You can work to improve yourself a little bit. And third strategy is to choose your path in a way where the weakness does not hurt you much. Now, I used to take the path of saying, okay, once I identified a weakness, I would say, okay, let me try to improve. But what I found is that actually starting to work with people who are strong at things that you are weak at is the best path, because that actually gives you the best context to even learn about it, because you can learn by imitation. You can learn by just seeing the scale, because if you're really, really bad at something, you do not even know what the scale is. You might improve twice as much. You may still be at 2%. Whereas when you are interacting with people who are really strong at things you're weak at, it allows not only to kind of do a trade, you can help them with whatever you're strong at and work together as a team, but by observing them and learning from them, you can improve what you can do. So that I found really useful from Ray Dalio on how to deal with weaknesses. John, over to you.
Yeah, so those are very important points, but these are contingent upon, especially the fourth and final point of working with people that are far surpassing your competence in that realm. You have to be humble and check your ego, because sometimes what can happen is you can project and say, yes, they're very good at that, but like I'm better than them at this realm, so I'm going to ignore them. Like that used to happen to me early on in like when I would when I would like try to develop my social circle, I would get around people like who were really, really intelligent, and they're very, very well read in like realms I was completely ignorant of. Let's say the classics, or I don't know, when I was first getting into philosophy or something. And there's two things you can do. You can get insecure, you can feel smaller and feel attacked and take it personal, like, oh my God, I don't know anything. Or you can say, oh my God, I don't know anything. You get excited because you have this rich resources around you. So you have that it's contingent upon your attitude as well. So my, can I share my takeaway? Did everybody share? Okay, cool.
Please.
So I took away the beauty of ambiguity in works of fiction themselves. I loved how many different interpretations there were of the story itself and the themes. I believe it was, his name was Larry. He was talking about how like the main theme was the phenomenon of Charlie getting used by the researchers so they could further their own like selfish ends of their career and reputation. That was a good one. I didn't really think of. I mean, I addressed it, but it wasn't like a prominent theme. Another really, really interesting one Joseph brought up was like misplaced intentions. So like Charlie wanted love, but his intentions, he psychologically displaced it into conflated with intellect. So that was just misplaced intentions. And like I was talking about this in the breakout group, I think that's one of the markers of I guess utility of a work of fiction is that it's equivocal nature. So like you can have so many different interpretations, and it'll facilitate so many different areas of discussion around it. And that's what I really think makes a novel great and makes a piece of art great, or makes a movie great. There's no one right or wrong interpretation. It's just like you imposing your beliefs onto that canvas, which I think is really cool. So actually, with that said, I think it's a good opportunity to talk about next week. For everybody that's here, we're going to talk about the story, The Alchemist. And this is, I'm going to take it through the lens of like the nature of tribulation. So how this main character went through trial and tribulation and obstacles, and like your attitude toward obstacles. What do? Do you give up at a certain point, or do you just mindlessly keep pushing? We're going to explore all types of implications there. Reading is of course not mandatory. I'll summarize it just like I did with Algernon here, but I mean, I would recommend it. It's actually one of my favorite fiction books of all time. So yeah, thank you everybody for coming and spending your night here. It's appreciated. I hope to see you next time. Shrikant, did you have anything else to say?
Yeah, no, it's always amazing to see everybody's perspective on things. And I would say that I always like to find a place where I am the dumbest guy, because that's where you learn the most. So I'm always looking to learn. And so that's very much identify with that. So I'm going to start off. Anybody who wants to stick around is welcome to stay in the breakout rooms. I'm going to run the breakout rooms till about 11:30 today. So I'm starting the breakout rooms now.